The Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture is delighted to welcome Dr. Edouard Machery. Dr. Machery received his PhD from the University of Paris, Sorbonne. He's currently the Distinguished Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. He also serves as the Director for the Center for Philosophy of Science and is a member of the Center for the Neural Basis of Cognition, which is housed both at Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon. He's also adjunct research professor in the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. Dr. Machery's scholarship concerns the philosophy of science, focusing primarily on psychology and cognitive neuroscience. His work has addressed a number of philosophical issues in the cognitive sciences, including concepts, moral psychology, the relevance of evolutionary biology for understanding cognition, modularity, and the nature, origins, and ethical significance of prejudiced cognition. In addition to his theoretical work, he is involved in the development of experimental philosophy with empirical work examining moral psychology, semantics, and folk epistemology, often with a cross-cultural focus. Dr. Machery has published extensively with over 150 journal articles and chapters that appear in both philosophy and cognitive science journals. In addition to books and edited volumes, Dr. Machery's most recent book is entitled Philosophy Within Its Proper Bounds. Dr. Machery has accrued this list of honors and awards too numerous for me to name here. We would be here all day. But most recently was awarded a John Templeton funded fellowship entitled Geography of Philosophy, Universality and Diversity in Philosophical Concepts. We're so excited to have Dr. Machery here today. We've been trying to get him for many semesters now. The title of Dr. Machery's talk today is Religion and the Scope of Morality. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming. Yes.
Absolutely. Many thanks for this very kind introduction. So let me just share my screen, making sure everything works the way it's supposed to work. All right. Can you see the screen? Wonderful. All right, so again, thanks again for having me today. I wish I were with you, but so at the end of the pandemic, the good news is that we can see the end of it, and in a matter of a few months, life will look a little bit more normal than it has been over the last year. So we should rejoice in this respect. Right, let me just start by describing a decade-long research interest and research projects I've had and to locate today's talk in that research project. So an important aspect of human life and human cognition that both philosophers, psychologists, and anthropologists have highlighted is the fact that we live in a world of norms. There are norms that govern what we do, what we say, the way we dress, the way we interact with one another, and often the way we think. These norms can be formal, they can be explicit, but most often they're just informal, right? They just permeate the way they're the way we live. Not only that, there are norms and norms, by which I mean there are kinds of norms, right? For example, here on the screen, you can see norms that we could classify as conventional norms, norms of etiquette, the fact that one has to wear, for example, if you're a man in most companies in North America, at least for some types of job, you have to wear a tie at work. You've got norms that govern just coordination, such as, for example, a norm governing traffic. But in addition to these kinds of norms, you also have what we do recognize as moral norms, right? Social not killer. So one of the questions I've been having is what distinguishes those norms? What distinguishes for lay people these different types of norms? Are those distinctions between kinds universal, right? So do all cultures distinguish the types of norms that we, whoever we is, maybe we Westerners, we Americans, or what have you, do happen to be distinguishing? If not, how do they vary? What are the variables that determine which norms happen to be singled out as a distinct kind? Is there, for example, an evolutionary explanation of some of the distinctions between norms people are making? So that's a research project I've been engaged in for now 10 years. A specific form of this type of question, a specific question within this cluster of questions focuses on the distinction between moral norms and other types of norms or other kinds of norms. And one thing I've been really puzzled by, one thing I've been really trying to get a handle on, is whether the distinction between moral norms and non-moral norms is a universal aspect of moral psychology. Whether wherever you go in the world, across cultures, people are going to be disposed to distinguish some norms as being moral and other norms as being non-moral. And not only are going to be disposed to draw that distinction, whether that distinction has an impact on their behavior. For example, whether they react emotionally in a different manner when someone violates a moral norm and when someone violates a non-moral norm, right? If it's not a universal distinction, if it's just a historical contingent distinction, why did it emerge in some cultures? If it's a universal distinction that's found in every culture we know of, what is it, a biological distinction? Does it have an evolutionary history? Is it an adaptation? And if so, what could its function be? So I've written quite a lot on this topic over the last 10 years, mostly from a theoretical point of view. The project I want to be describing to you today focuses on a specific variable that might influence the way people draw a distinction between moral norms, the norms they recognize as being moral, and the norms they recognize as being non-moral. And this variable is the role of religious affiliation. So the question I will be focusing on in this lecture is, how does one's religious affiliation influence the distinction between moral and moral norms? And I will be focusing on 4 different religions. First, Judaism. Second, the Church of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as a Mormon church. Third, Islam, with I think all of our participants are Sunni. And third, Islam, and fourth, Hinduism. And we'll have a control group of non-believers, of secular individuals. Okay? So the question I will be examining today, and the data I'm going to be presenting, is whether religious affiliation has an impact on the way people distinguish norms they recognize as being moral and norms they recognize as being non-moral. So here's the way this lecture is going to be structured. I will first describe 2 main approaches to this question, which have been very influential in the field in moral psychology over the last 30 or 40 years. Then I will describe a new instrument that my colleagues and I have been developed over the last 10 years, really, and the way we've been trying to validate this instrument. Then I will describe the specific version of this instrument that we are using in the study I'm reporting today. And then I will present our empirical results as well as a brief application. And then I'll conclude, draw some lessons from this empirical work. So let's start with the 2 approaches. In moral psychology, the following question has not been settled clearly. Is the scope of the moral domain fixed? By which I mean, is there variation among demographic groups, be there religious groups, cultural groups, linguistic groups, and so on and so forth, political groups maybe, about what makes a given norm a moral norm, right? If you move, for example, from France to the USA, do people distinguish what counts as a moral norm from what counts as a non-moral norm in a different manner? And what about the Sichuan in the Amazonian basin? And what about religion? Does it affect the way the distinction is drawn? In the literature, in the scholarship, you'll find 2 very different perspectives on the matter. On the one hand, you have the view of Turiel, and I'll describe it in a minute. And on the other hand, you have a more recent view, now which has become a classic, developed by Jonathan Haidt and Jesse Graham. So let's start with Turiel's moral domain theory. It's very well known. It's one of the classics of psychology. Turiel and colleagues have argued now for decades and provided a very large amount of evidence that children and adults, of children from very early age on, and adults across a range of culture, draw a distinction between moral norms and non-moral norms, which we call conventional norms, according to 3 main criteria. And the criteria here are on the screen. Violating a moral norm is very bad. It's very bad to kill someone. It's very bad to lie. Violating a conventional norm isn't that bad. If you forgot your tie at work, well, it's bad. It's not, no one's going to kill you. Moral norms are viewed to hold everywhere and at all times. It's wrong to lie here and now. It's wrong to lie in China. It's wrong to lie in ancient Rome, right? So their scope is universal. By contrast, non-moral norms are viewed to be local, right? It might be wrong not to wear a tie at work here, but there's no expectation that it's wrong everywhere and at every time. Moral norms are viewed by lay people as authority independent. So if tomorrow or Biden tells us from now on, it's okay to torture puppies from the fun of it, it's still wrong to torture puppies for the fun of it, right? The wrongness of the action does not depend on authority. By contrast, if a CEO tells you from now on, you can come on Friday, it's casual wear, then on Friday, you don't need to come with a tie at work, right? So conventional norms are viewed to be authority dependent. Finally, the grounds for these norms are viewed by lay people as being different. Moral norms are justified on the basis of harm or welfare consideration, on the basis of the rights of people, or on the basis of justice or fairness considerations. By contrast, conventional norms are justified on the basis of authority or convention. So Turiel has argued that this distinction emerges very early on in life, is universal, and is found across demographic groups. And indeed, in one of their most interesting papers, they provided evidence that Christian, Jewish, and non-believer children do draw the distinction between moral norms and non-moral norms in the same way, right? So the religious affiliation didn't seem to be influencing the way they drew the distinction. And here's a quote from that work. It was our expectation that denomination would not affect the way in which subjects evaluated moral rules. This expectation was based on previous findings from many studies showing that moral issues are consistently evaluated in accordance with individuals' concepts of welfare, justice, and rights. So on that view, the moral domain is narrow. It's really focused on a subset of possible concerns or interests or values, things related to welfare, justice, and rights. And it's independent of religious affiliation. A very different perspective emerges from John Haidt and Jesse Graham's moral foundation theory. On that view, instead of having a small number of concerns, there are in fact a larger number of concerns that can become moralized. As you probably know, Haidt and Graham have focused on five main concerns, 5 main topics, which he called foundations, and they sometimes add a 6th one. These topics are harm or welfare, just like Turiel, fairness or justice, you also find that in Turiel, but in addition to these 2 concerns, they add the following concern: loyalty, authority, sanctity, or sometimes called purity, and sometimes the 6th concern, freedom or liberty. So that's a first idea. So they got a broader set of possible concerns that can be part of the moral domain, that can be moralized. Furthermore, which of these concerns becomes moralized depends on demographic variables. So here what you have is one of the most famous graphs that was very influential in promoting moral foundation theory, that shows that liberals, so people on the left in the United States, tend to have a narrow focus when it comes to morality. They focus on harm, namely harm or welfare, and fairness. By contrast, conservatives have a much broader moral domain, which encompasses the 6 concerns of foundation that Haidt and Graham have identified. How does that relate to religion? Well, Graham and Haidt have been looking at the impact of religious affiliation on which foundations happens to be moralized, and they partly focus on big gods. Big gods are gods that know what you're doing, so they are omniscient. They care about what you're doing, they want you to behave the right way, and they're willing to punish you if you don't behave the right way. They're going to harm you. Now, the Christian God, The Muslim God, the Jewish God are prototypical examples of big gods, but there are other big gods in other religions. And their claim is that just like a political orientation, religious affiliation matters for the scope of the moral domain. Right? Religious moralities, as they say, also include concerns not built on the harm, care, and fairness reciprocity foundations. So on this view, religious commitment broadens the moral domain. We go beyond the narrow moral domain than atheists that are secular people would have. So we get the following picture. We have 5 or 6 moral foundations, or 5 or 6 moral concerns. Religion or religious affiliation moralizes norms which are drawn from the domains of purity, loyalty, and authority. Right? So we get these 2 very different pictures from the literature. On the one hand, the Turiel picture, where the scope of the moral domain and what counts as a moral norm is narrow and invariant. It's independent from religious affiliation. On the other hand, you have the Graham and Haidt pictures, according to which religious affiliation influences, broadens the moral domain. Now, we wanted to find out which, if any, of these 2 views is true, but we are very unsatisfied with the tools that both traditions have developed to study the moral domain. And I can come back to that question in the Q&A to explain, to justify a little bit this, dissatisfaction with the existing tool. So we decided to develop a new tool which was specifically which aimed specifically at trying to understand how people do distinguish moral from non-moral norms. And we call that tool the norm questionnaire. So the norm questionnaire is a very simple idea. We give people an example of a given norm. So for example, many people in England believe that people should not inflict pain on animals merely for amusement. And then we ask people 2 questions. The first one is an endorsement question. We ask people whether they agree that people in their community should not inflict pain on animals merely for amusement. So we ask people whether they endorse the norm described in another community. Right? If they say yes, they actually agree with the norm. If they say no, they are rejecting the norm. Then the second question, which is for our purpose the most important. We ask them to reflect to the judgment they just made when they answered the first question, and to categorize that judgment as being either a moral judgment or a non-moral judgment. Right? So consider, for example, you say, yes, people in my community, people in Pittsburgh, or Americans, should definitively not inflict pain on animals merely for amusement. I agree with the norm in England. And then I'm asked, well, consider the normative judgment you just made. Is that a moral judgment or not? And then I would say, yes, it's clearly a moral judgment. All right. In the first version of the norm questionnaire, we use a list of 20 questions. They're all drawn from, they're all real norm. They're drawn from the human relation area files. They were not selected randomly, they were hand-picked, since the goal was to validate the study. I'll give you a second to look at it. And again, again, for each of these norm, participants use a 2 questions, whether they endorse the norm, and once they've endorsed the norm, whether the endorsement is a moral judgment or a non-moral judgment. What we do in our analysis is focus on the second question, whether their first judgment is a moral judgment or a non-moral judgment. And we use cluster analysis to group the variables, namely to group the norms that people are presented with, right? And the idea is that cluster analysis is going to reveal the similarities between all these norms and identify whether people do distinguish moral norms from non-moral norms. The moral cluster is going to be the cluster with the highest, with the lowest mean answer to the second question. When people say, yes, it's definitively a moral judgment, right? So that's the way we analyze the data. We've looked at, as you probably know, there are many algorithms for doing hierarchical cluster analysis. We've looked at the robustness of our analysis for many of these cluster algorithms. You always find some variation depending on which algorithm you use or which metric you use, but there's quite a lot of convergence between the various ways of analyzing our data using hierarchical cluster analysis. All right, so that's a new tool. I hope the tool is clear enough. What we wanted to do first was to validate it, and I'll try to describe to you how we've validated it. Our first strategy was to use a specific group of individuals that we know very well because we belong to it, namely philosophers. So the idea here was that, look, philosophers, we know how they're going to answer. We know they distinguish moral norms from non-moral norms. Indeed, they write extensively on the topics. They write books and articles, and they obsess about it. And we know how they're going to answer this question. Can our instrument recover the distinctions we know that philosophers are going to be making? Right, that was our attempt to validate this instrument. So we gave the norm questionnaire to 657 participants. They were sampled by means of, we advertised a survey on blogs and various social media. And because cluster analysis is not an inferential statistical technique, it's a descriptive statistical technique, there is no power for the study, so we didn't have a target sample size. Our goal was just to get as many participants as we can, and indeed 600 is quite a lot of participants for cluster analysis. That's the demographic data. I'll move on that, and I'll just show you the cluster analysis that emerges from philosophers' answers. So what you get is two very clear clusters that are face value. That's a cluster we were antecedently expecting philosophers to draw. On the top, you have the moral cluster, which means that the mean answers to the second question is significantly lower than the mean answer to the second question for the non-moral cluster. And what you get is a clustering of the norms we were expecting philosophers to cluster together. And on the bottom, you get the other clusters that we call conveniently the non-moral cluster. Not only that, do you get these partitions that's very meaningful, the subclusters are also totally meaningful. So for example, if you look at the non-moral cluster, the norms related to authority, the way you should relate to someone who has power, is our professor or a judge, are clustered together. The norms that are related to being careful, wearing sunscreen and crossing the street are related together. The norms that are related to ways of life, purely conventional norms, cluster together. So it's exactly what you would be expecting if our instrument, our norm questionnaire, the new instrument, were recovering the norms people are antecedently committed to. So that was one way to validate the study. We did the same study with lay people. They are M-Turkers. Their demographics are here. They're quite similar to the demographics of philosophers, except in terms of genders, as you would expect. Most philosophers are men, based on the discipline's demographics. But the age is quite similar, and so is the religious affiliation, roughly. What you get here is all Americans. What you get here is a very similar clustering, at least at the higher cluster point, right? So the same norms that philosophers that are classified in the moral cluster by philosophers are also classified in the non-moral cluster, is a moral cluster by lay people. The norms that are classified in the non-moral clusters are classified in the non-moral clusters by lay people. And indeed, the subclusters are very similar to one another. And again, that's what we were antecedently expecting, right? Because we are American. So it was the sort of distinction we were expecting participants to make. Again, that's a way to validate our tool. It's able to recover the distinction that we think should be made. The third way we validated our study was to see whether our tool can predict the way lay people relate to norm violators. So the idea here is that most psychologists, anthropologists, philosophers expect people to have different reaction to someone who violates a moral norm and someone who violates a non-moral norm. So for example, people are going to be more angry, they're going to have a moral outrage against someone who violated moral norms, but less so towards someone who violates a non-moral norm. Someone who violates moral norms might feel more guilt than someone who violates a non-moral norm, right? So we looked at a range of reactive attitudes related to norm violation. And our prediction was that the norms that we happen to cluster in the moral domain by an independent group of subjects would be judged to elicit stronger emotional reaction than the norms that happen to be classified as a non-moral cluster by an independent group of participants. So what you see here are the reactive attitudes or the emotional reaction we focus on, and the results are again as expected, right? The norms that we classify, the norms that the norm questionnaire and the cluster analysis classify as being moral on the basis of an independent group of participants are judged to elicit more negative reaction than the norms that are classified as being non-moral by the norm questionnaire and the cluster analysis. Again, all that goes, we believe, a long way toward validating the norm questionnaire. The norm questionnaire is recovering a distinction between norms people are committed to that is supposed to be recovered. All right, that was our attempt to create a new tool and to validate it. Now, what we wanted to do was expand this set of norms to religious norms. And here's what we did for this project. We interviewed religious people from Jewish religious people, Muslim religious people, Hindu religious people, Mormon religious people, and created a universe of norms. We asked them to list as many norms as they could. And for each religion, we had a few hundred norms. And then we randomly sampled a small subset of these norms. Right? To have a manageable questionnaire, we had to sample only 10 Jewish norms, 10 Muslim norms, 10 Hindu norms, 10 LDS norms, to which we added 5 non-moral norms drawn from the previous questionnaires and 5 moral norms drawn from the previous questionnaire. So again, that's the same type of experiment. We describe a real norm, which is accepted by Jewish people. Many Jews believe that they should marry another Jew. And then they have the usual 2 questions. Do you agree about this norm, and consider the judgment you just made? Is that a moral judgment? Here are some of the norms for some of the Jewish norms, at least the ones that were given by a participant. Many Jews believe that the family should have at least 2 children. Many Jews believe that one should not attend services of religions other than their own. For Islam, many Muslims believe that a single boy and single girl should not be alone with one another unless their families are considering their marriage, and so on and so forth. Same thing for LDS. Many Mormons believe that people should receive baptism and confirmation in their church. And Hinduism, many Hindus believe that they should use only their right hand for important actions like eating or serving others. And that's the moral and non-moral norms that are drawn from the previous study. So we end up with 50 norms, 10 for each of the 4 religions we are looking at, plus 5 prototypical moral norms and 5 prototypical non-moral norms. And again, that's the same type of experimental design. A participant sees a norm. She has to say whether she endorses the norm, and then she has to reflect on her endorsement and decide whether it's a moral endorsement or a non-moral endorsement. And again, we use cluster analysis based on these 50 norms to try to identify how these norms cluster to one another and to see whether religious affiliation is going to influence people's clusterings of kinds of norms. All right. Here are the predictions that, on the one hand, Turiel, and on the other hand, Graham and Haidt are making. If you're Turiel, you're going to be predicting a narrow moral domain focused on the prototypical moral norms to the exclusion of the religious norms. Right? Religious affiliation does not impact the scope of the moral domain, and it's narrowly focused on justice, rights, and justice, right, and welfare. By contrast, if you're Haidt and Graham, you're going to be predicting that in addition to this narrow set of norms, religions are going to vary depending on which norms happens to be moralized. So, for example, Jews should be willing to moralize many Jewish norms. Mormons should be willing to moralize many Mormon norms. Muslims should be willing to moralize many Muslim norms. And Hindu should be willing to moralize many Hindu norms. All right, which of these 2 predictions, if any, is right? So let me turn to our study. I will present first the results of the main study, then very quickly mention the replication of that study we've also completed, and before moving to the discussion. All right. I'm running a little bit late, but I think I should be able to finish in 10 minutes or something like that. So again, our 5 sample: Jews, Mormons, Muslims, Hindus, and seculars. They're not perfectly balanced. They vary in some respects. They vary particularly in terms of age, and maybe importantly in terms of languages. So the Hindus, most of them, so they were all collected by Qualtrics panel. They all are living in the USA. But as you can see from the data, most Hindus are immigrants and they're not born in the USA and do not have English as their native speakers. Most of them, that's the last row of these descriptive statistics, most of them are extremely religious, right? Except, of course, for the secular, who happens to be on the non-religious side. In addition to having this general measure of religiosity, we also had an ad hoc measure of religiosity for each religion, asking whether participants were following 4 different religious practices, characteristics of their religion, and so that resulted in a score from 0 following none of these religious requirements to 4 following these 4 religious requirements. And as you can see, all our religious participants are quite religious. They do follow most of the religious requirements in their religion, and they're relatively balanced in that respect. So we have
Edouard, could I interrupt just for a minute? You have plenty of time.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So don't worry about
that.
Rush?
Okay, good.
Yeah. So we started at 4:20. So please feel free to go into the 5 o'clock hour.
All right. Wonderful.
I'm sorry to interrupt, and I hope.
I'm actually glad because I can speak very quickly, and if you don't stop me, I can really speak very quickly.
Okay. No, I mean you're doing it's fine, but I just you had mentioned it, so you have plenty of time. So
wonderful. Yeah. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. So our samples, as you can see, while they are not perfectly balanced, not balanced in terms of age, nor in terms of linguistic competence, are balanced in other respects, namely in terms of religious practice and religiosity. All right, so what I want to do next is to describe the results religion by religion, starting with our best friend Dawkins, who here is going to be standing for the secular individual. So the secular individual, again, what we do, we give them the 50 different norms. For each norm, they have 2 questions. Do you endorse the norm? Is that a moral judgment? Then we use cluster analysis to look at the similarity between the judgments about those norms. And we identify the moral cluster by looking at the mean answers to the second question, right, to the moral judgment question. And here is the pattern you find among secular individuals. As you would be expecting, the prototypical norms all cluster together. In addition to these clusters, you have a few additional norms drawn from every religion. And when you read the content of these norms, it's not very surprising that secular people would judge them to be moral. So, for example, laws, the norm was the following one: many Jews believe that they can break almost any religious law in order to save a human life. If you have moral concerns driven by welfare, for example, or harm, you would judge that to be a moral norm. The same is true for honesty. Many Mormons believe that they should be honest with and kind to their fellow beings. Again, that's a prototypical moral norms, right? So it's not very surprising that these religious norms get to be classified as moral by secular. But it's really remarkable that most religious norms, well, it's remarkable, not unexpected, but that most religious norms don't fall into the moral cluster. That's compatible with both Turiel's view and Haidt's view, right? Turiel predicts a narrow moral domain focused on harm and fairness and rights. That's what we observe here. It's compatible with Haidt and Graham's view. Why? Because secular tend to be focusing on two of the five foundations, namely harm and fairness. So these results are compatible with the two perspectives we started with. Now let's move from latter-day Sense. So latter-day Sense, you get a very different pictures. Latter-day Sense, just like secular individual, moralize the prototypical moral norms, right? They are at the core of the moral cluster. But they also happen to moralize most of their own religious norms and a few norms from other religions. So for example, and that's of course at odds with what Turiel would have led us to expect, right? For Turiel, the moral domain remains invariant across religious affiliation. It's compatible with what Haidt would lead us to expect, because religious affiliation leads people to broaden their moral domain. And indeed, it's interesting to look at the dendrogram, at the results of the cluster analysis that comes from Mormons. So what you see here is the hierarchical cluster analysis for Mormon. At the bottom of your screen, in the largest red square, it is the set of moral norms, so that's a moral cluster. And the moral clusters include most of the Mormon norms. Most of the Mormon norms, they're indicated by a green arrow, right? And they also include all the norms that secular individuals had identified as moral norms, which are in blue, right? So for example, you're going to get the following norm: 10% of income should be donated to church. Religious people thought that it was not a moral norms. Mormons think it is a moral norms. Families should spend time together daily to study religious texts. Non-moral, secular individuals do not think it's a moral norms. Mormons think it's a moral norm. So these religious norms that are characteristic of the Church of Latter-day Saints happen to be moralized. They're classified together with prototypical moral norms. In addition to these Mormon or Latter-day Saint norms, you also have a few norms drawn from other religions. It's very clear why they happen to be moralized, because they are perfectly meaningful from the perspective of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. For example, one of the Jewish norms was that no vulgar language should be uttered around a rabbi. It's perfectly a meaningful norm if you are a Latter-day Saint. Hindu people should worship many deities. So here, Mormons say no in the first question. So we reject this judgment. And when you ask them, was your rejection a moral judgment? They say yes, it was a moral judgment. Right? So the rejection of polytheism is viewed to be a moral matter. Again, it's perfectly meaningful pattern of result. So here we get a pattern of results that's at odds with Turiel's conception of the moral domain, but very much in line with Jonathan Haidt and Jesse Graham's conception. What about Muslims? You get a very similar type of results among Muslims. Again, Muslims are going to moralize the prototypical moral norms, and in addition to those, they're also going to moralize the norms of their own religion. Again, that's compatible with what Haidt predicts, and at odds with what Turiel predicts. What about Jews? So we've seen so far, if you can't score, that Haidt and Graham are really winning the comparison so far. What you do find is that religion seems to broaden the scope of the moral domain. However, when you look at Jewish participants, you get a very different picture. Jewish participants behave exactly like non-believers. The very same norms that a secular individual single out as being moral are singled out by Jews. That's what Turiel would predict: a narrow moral domain centered around harm and fairness. It's very much inconsistent. It's very much at odds with what Haidt and Graham would be predicting. That's the picture you get here. All the Jewish religious norms cluster together. They really neatly cluster together. They're recognized as being a distinct kind by Jewish participants. But this kind is very different from the kind of norms that they recognize as being the moral kind of norm, as being the moral norms. And it's really quite remarkable here that extremely religious participants, extremely religious Jews, happen to classify norms exactly as non-believers do, right? It's exactly the same type of clustering you obtain from non-believers. Again, that's really at odds with what Haidt would predict, very much in line with what Turiel would be predicting. What about Hindus? You might say, well, Hindus are really an interesting group. It turns out there is no clustering that emerges from the data we get. If you look at the cluster we look at, as you can see here, you end up with a partition at the end, because hierarchical cluster analysis always ends up with a partition, but you don't get a division between two kinds of norms. Norms get to be added with one another without having a distinction between the two types of norms. So the distinction here between moral norms and non-moral norms that made sense for both non-believers, Jews, Muslims, and Latter-day Saints, don't seem to be making a lot of sense for Hindus. All right, we replicated this finding with a smaller sample size. In this replication, in contrast to the first study, where the participants were sampled by means of quadratic panel. In that study, they were sampled by snowball sampling and advertisement on social media. So since it was a replication, we were happy with having a smaller sample size for each of the groups we looked at. We looked at Jewish, Mormon, and secular participants. And we replicated the findings I presented to you earlier. Jews, again, have a very narrow cluster of moral norms, the same one that we observed earlier, which is identical with a cluster of moral norms that you find, that you can extract from a non-believer's answers to our questionnaire. By contrast, Latter-day Saints have a much enlarged, a much broadened moral domain that includes both the prototypical moral norms and their own religious norms, replicating the earlier results. All right, so that's it for the empirical data. What I want to do in the next few minutes is summarize this data, try to see how they bear on the original study, and raise some questions that I'm going to be examining in forthcoming follow-up works. All right, we started with the following contrast between, on the one hand, Machery and Turiel, who postulate a universal narrow domain, which is invariant toward demographic identity, including religious affiliation. And on the other hand, Graham and Haidt, who postulate a domain that varies across demographic identity and that is influenced by religious affiliation. We saw that some of our participants fit well with Machery and Turiel. Indeed, non-believers and Jews have a narrow moral domain, but Mormons, Latter-day Saints, I didn't present you the data, but other Christians and Muslims have a much broader moral domain. The outcome is that Machery and Turiel's prediction is invalidated. It's been falsified by our data. By contrast, Graham and Haidt made a prediction that the domain that religious affiliation is going to influence people's moral commitments, what people take to be moral norms, and that big gods, you might remember, have broad modalities. In contrast to secular individuals. Again, the data from secular individuals, from Latter-day Saints, from Christians, and from Muslims fit very well with their view. Non-believers have a narrow moral domain. By contrast, Christians who are non-Latter-day Saints, and Muslims have a much enlarged moral domain. Very much in line with what Graham and Haidt will be predicting. However, religious Jews happen to be falsifying them. Religious Jews, a prototypical big God, have a very lean morality, and they do not moralize the norms they are themselves committed to. So it looks like when Turiel was thinking about the moral domain, he really had in mind the non-believer moral domain. When John Haidt is thinking about moral domain, he really has in mind the Christian moral domain, right? And they do generalize from these prototypical moral domains to the religious moral domain in general. In fact, what we've learned from our studies is that you cannot generalize to religion and morality. It's not like big gods have large moral domain. Some big gods have an enlarged morality. Other big gods have a lean and narrow morality. Namely, the Jewish God has a narrow morality. So contrary to current scholarship on religious and political cognition, not all believers broaden the moral domain. Jews have a narrow moral domain in contrast to LDS member and non-LDS Christians. And something I didn't insist on for the sake of time, but we can come back to during the Q&A, there's also variation in the way norms are moralized across religion, right? Even those religions that moralize norm don't moralize it the same way. And we can come back to that in a minute. To say nothing of Hindus who happens not to be drawing a distinction between moral norms and non-moral norms. So we at least have two kinds of religions. We have moralizing religions that take their own norms and treat them as similar to the norms that everyone recognizes as moral norms. Everyone maybe except, those who recognize the moral and non-moral distinctions recognize as moral norms. And you have non-moral, you have religions that are non-moralizing. They do recognize the religious norm as a distinct type of norms, but they do not treat them as similar to the moral norms. Now, why is that the case? What distinguishes these two types of religion? Well, here are three hypotheses, two out of which are falsified, but I wanted to mention them nonetheless. One might think, for example, that dominant religion, so religions that dominate in a given country, are going to moralize religion, but non-dominant religions won't. Right? So, after all, if your religion is dominant, you might want to say that your norms are moral norms in order to make them more influential. But that does not work because Islam in North America and the Church of Latter-day Saints are minority religions, but they nonetheless moralize their own norms. So this hypothesis doesn't work. One might think, for example, that Abrahamic religions are moralizing religion. But again, that doesn't work because Judaism is, of course, an Abrahamic religion. And Judaism does, if our data are correct, Judaism does not moralize their own norms. So a third hypothesis that's compatible with our data, but of course a post hoc hypothesis, so it has not been tested by our data. The third hypothesis is that religions that proselytize have broad domains. If you're a religion that think that it's part of your religious mission to convert other people, as for example do Christians, Muslims, including Latter-day Saints, then it makes sense to treat your norms as being as important or as being of the same kind as moral norms. Right? One way to test this view is to look at Christians who happen to have a non-proselytizing form of religion. So Amish, for example, are Christian, but they don't proselytize. Right? They don't try to expand the number of people who are becoming Amish. If that's the right explanation for the distinction between moralizing religion and non-moralizing religion we've observed in our data, then the prediction would be that Amish would have a narrow moral domain, very similar to the one Jews and non-believers have. If this hypothesis is wrong, then Amish might have a large moral domain. But again, then we would have to find another explanation for why some religions are moralizing and other religions are not. We haven't yet done the study with Amish, but we hope to do it in the near future and looking at other groups that vary along other dimensions. Now it's time to conclude. I'd like to thank my co-authors in this project. The first author of this project is Sidney Levin, who is a postdoctoral fellow at MIT and Harvard. Other people who've been involved are Elizabeth O'Neill, who is a professor at Idaho University of Technology, Josh Rothman, a psychologist at Franklin Marshall, Taylor Davis, a philosopher at Purdue, Steve Teach, my frequent collaborator, a philosopher at Rutgers, and myself. This study was in part funded by the Structural Evolution of Religious Research Consortium at UBC. Thank you for their very generous financial support. If you're interested, since I've been delayed to give this talk for 2 years, the paper is now out. It's been just published in Social Cognition a couple of months ago. So if you're interested, you can see more about that research project. And there's much more about the supplementary materials that I've been able to present today. And thank you for your attention. All right.
I think we have Well, we have some time for questions. So either raise hand or just unmute and ask a question. I think we have a group that could be polite about it. Yeah? Bob.
Yeah, hi. One question that pops to mind is concerns some findings about sort of alternative measures for all of these things, as opposed to sort of having self-reports or checking on things like, you know, religious activities. I mean, those things are perfectly reasonable measures to employ. But there is this research out there that shows, for example, it's sort of like, who do you trust?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the sort of startling findings about this, right, is that apparently the atheists and secular folks are more willing to trust the religious folks than they are to trust other atheists and secular folks. Mm-hmm. I just wonder if you could comment about how that fits into this picture.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think that the two measures are quite orthogonal to one another. And I think the Jews here, the Jewish participants and the Jewish way of classifying norms into kind is the best way of highlighting the point. So if you look among the measures we had one of a measure of importance. And so we were asking people how important those norms were. And Jews take the Jewish norms to be extremely important. Right? They just don't classify them. They just don't classify them as being moral norms. So it's not like moral norms are viewed to be more important than other norms, including their own religious norms. It's just they're a different kind. So it does suggest that people don't, that norms are going to vary along various dimensions. One, whether they're classified as moral versus non-moral, independently from that distinction, whether a norm is important for a given group or not. Now, my prediction, but again, it's just a prediction, is that trust would be more related to the importance of a norm in contrast to its moral nature, right? So here's a thought focusing on the Jewish participants, is that if you know of someone that, like let's say a Jewish person, because that would be relevant in the case of the Jewish sample. If you know of a religious Jewish person who is violating the religious norms, right, you would be much less likely to trust him or her, right? So trust here is really a function of the importance of a norm rather than whether it's a moral norm, right? So, you know, even if you consider that Shabbat is a moral matter, which most Jews, according to Odetta, don't consider that Shabbat is a moral matter, you view Shabbat as being extremely important, right? Observing Shabbat is extremely important to your Jewish life. It's just not a moral matter. If you know that your neighbor is Jewish, is maybe an Orthodox Jew, but that somehow is not observing Shabbat, he's turning the light on and off. He's turning his oven on and off on Friday evening instead of calling his goyim neighbor. Well, then you're unlikely to trust that person as much because that person violates a norm that matters for you. So it's just a speculation, but my prediction is that trust is more related to importance than to morality, to the moral status of the norm. And indeed, it's confounded in North America, right? When you ask, for example, non-believers or Christian, whether they would trust someone who does something immoral, well, you get the answer no. But it's confounded it confounds two things: the moral status of the norm and its importance, because for non-believers and for Christians in North America, the two overlaps, right? Christian norms are moral and they're very important, right? But if you look at denominations, at affiliation, religious affiliation that do deconfound importance and the moral status, my prediction, again, it's a speculation, I think that's really a good question. My prediction is that trust would be tracking importance rather than morality? But it's a great question, actually. It would be really easy to, using our own study right now that we have these dendrograms and this classification, we could just ask people, who would you trust? And we could see whether the trust measure follows the morality classification or another measures defined over these norms. It's really an interesting question that we should definitely do in the future.
Edouard, I had a question about your measure of morality. So do you think that when people endorse a statement or say that what I just evaluated is a moral judgment, is that signifying that they believe that morality is at the basis of it? Or might it be something like a moral dumbfounding effect, whereby I have this strong feeling about something, and in order to justify it, I'm going to appeal to morality? So I guess your data in some way could get to that. That is, do you find more endorsements of, yes, this was moral, for previous responses that were rated as either 1 or 7?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yes, I think the answer is probably yes. So yes, I think the answer is yes. So making sure I got the question right. You mean the answer to the first question, to the endorsement question, right? So whether you want people who have a strong endorsement of the view. Right.
So I strongly agree or disagree with this statement, and now I'm being posed with the question as, did I just make a moral judgment? You could imagine, well, maybe my strong agreement or disagreement is born out of the fact that it was moral versus I feel strongly or not about it, and I'm justifying it through morality.
No, I think that's right. So I don't know exactly what's in your mind. You know, you could have two interpretations of what you're saying. One of them is that it's a confound for the study, right? We're not really getting at people's concept of morality, but more at people's emotional reaction. The other one, which is what many philosophers think, for example, is that there's really a tight connection between what we call moral and at least some emotional reaction. So it's not really a confound. You know, people use, in fact, their, saying something is moral is as much expressing an emotion as making a descriptive judgment, right? So on that view, it's not quite a confound. It's actually perfectly rational, so to speak, to use your emotional reaction as a guide, and maybe it's constitutive of your concept of morality. That moral norms are those norms that elicit this very strong emotional reaction. Many philosophers have that view. Actually, they take the concept of moral to be more of an expression rather than a description, right? So when you say morally wrong, you say, woo! That's really what you're saying, rather than saying anything about the norm in itself, right? So it's really entangled with actually quite difficult. It's partly an empirical question. It's also an empirical question about what people mean when they say something is moral. So in many ways, to answer your question, is that a confound or not? Our validation study might not be sufficient. We'd have to maybe look a bit more, do a little bit more of lexical semantics and see what there is more to the content of the word moral and that kind of things.
I wouldn't say that I would categorize it as a confound. I mean, maybe someone would, but rather, I guess I find myself just a little more intrigued about the potential mechanism here.
Right.
So you could imagine you're showing pretty convincing data across all of these different studies and measures that there is an effect of religiosity. And I actually have another question on that in like a second, if that's cool. But I guess, if you ran all these participants in like a speeded task, for example, like the whole system 1, system 2, would you continue to get the same pattern of findings? And maybe that could help arbitrate between these two accounts. But to get to the other question, throughout your talk, I kept being reminded of the set of findings by Desetti on religiosity across cultures. And then they kind of came up with like an amendment or a retraction of some sort.
Yeah, retraction,
it wasn't religion per se, but rather country of origin that predicted these findings. Yeah. And while a lot of your data came from participants in the United States, and also recognizing that the boundaries between culture and religion are pretty fuzzy, to what extent are you willing to say that these are reflecting religiosity rather than just like cultural upbringing?
So So let me just say the speed of task is a great idea. Would be really nice, for example. I mean, here's a nice finding. You get the same narrow moral domain when you do a speed of task, and you get the variation in when you give people more. That would be a really interesting. Also, would be interesting from a just mechanistic point of view, right? Would say a little bit more about the kind of influences that determine treating something as a moral question. So that would be a really interesting follow-up type of study, doable online. So maybe also that's something I should consider. So that's really nice. Now the second question is a really difficult question, as you know. I mean, culture and religions are just hard to entangle. I suppose what we'd have to be doing here is look, for example, at people educated in one. So people educated in a dominant. I mean, what about that? We turn toward, we collect data in predominantly Hindu or maybe Muslim, well, let's say Muslim context, and not like Tunisia, for example, or Morocco, and we identify those people who are non-believers, for a difficult thing to do for obvious reason, and we see whether they behave more like prototypical American non-believers, or whether they behave more like Muslims. That could be one way. If so, if they behave more like Muslims, then you might think it's more about culture, your cultural upbringing, even if it's not your commitments, right? And it's also quite doable. Now, for the Geography of Philosophy project that was mentioned, that Lynn was nice to mention earlier, we are working with collecting a lot of data in Morocco, so we have contacts there. It's hard to get people, and there are plenty of non-believers in Morocco, but it's hard to get people to say they're non-believers. Even when they are non-believers, they don't go around telling other people that they're non-believers, except their best friends, maybe. So in all our data, we've got 99% of believers, but it's just not true. And our local informers, this measure is meaningless in this present context, because people, even if they don't believe in Allah, are not going to tell you. It's just not the kind of things you can be open about. But in principle, that would be a very nice site to try to disentangle a little bit the broader cultural impact that you get from your education, whether or not you happen yourself to have a religious commitment. I mean, I was raised as a Catholic and a non-believer at this point. So someone, and I was raised in France, as you might hear, you surely hear. And France, of course, has a Catholic culture, but so most people aren't religious at this point. So I think that was, these kind of places would be nice to disentangle the two factors you're looking at. So yeah, thanks. I saw a hand, I think, by Anna Maria. Is that right?
You answered my question. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
We have another question.
I'm game to ask another one. That is, religions are many splendid things. The notion that there are two kinds strikes me as probably an underestimate. And that is to say, lots of stuff that we are inclined to count as religions, particularly, say, in small-scale societies. I'm just wondering, I presume it would have to be speculation.
I plead guilty here. You're obviously right. And even if you look at the big God religions, right? So excluding, for example, the forms of religion you find in most small-scale, of course, many small-scale societies these days have big God religion because of the influence of Christianity. I work with the Shiwiyas, the Shipibo in the Amazonian basin, and in my projects, they're all in part Christian. But even if you exclude there, I quite totally agree with you that even if you focus on world religions, I think a division between two is unlikely to be enough. Hinduism is a good case. If our data are true, and I'm really puzzled and interested by our data for Hinduism, it's a complicated set of data because our Hindu participants are not native speakers of English. That might be what explains the data. So to be taken with a grain of salt. But no, Hinduism is, so I'm not an expert of Hinduism, so correct me, but I do think they do have, in some respect, a big God religion, namely at least some of their God cares about what you're doing, punish you, and know what you're doing. In that respect, they are big gods, and so they're quite different from, of course, Abrahamic gods. But that's neither a moralizing nor a non-moralizing religion, because if our data are to be believed, they don't even draw the distinction between what's moral and what's not moral, right? So it's yet another very different type of pattern that just does not fall into this division and rule. So I totally agree with you. A much more subtle set of distinction has to be drawn. It's interesting when you look at Hinduism. So in many of the languages in India, there is no translation for the word moral, right? So the word moral is just not translated in Bengali. There's no translation. So it's not. It doesn't mean they don't have a concept, but it's at the very least not a lexicalized concept. That does suggest our data might be actually not simply an artifact of the poor linguistic competence of a participant, that actually might not draw, that might not be a salient distinction for all participants. I totally agree with you. And we haven't done anything related among small scale in, let's say, among the Shipibo or the Shibuya, and I don't even know whether there's a word that corresponds to moral in these languages. I'd be very surprised, but it's an interesting question. I saw another hand that was raised a few minutes ago.
Oh.
I was just going to ask a follow-up question. You already addressed it about the difference between the Jewish participants and the Hindu participants. It seemed like the Hindu participants saw everything as a convention. So
it's hard to say whether they see everything as convention or everything as moral, or they just don't draw the distinction. Here's the analogy I usually say. If you take everything to be a chair, or if you take nothing to be a chair, you probably don't know what a chair is, right? So knowing what a chair is to be able to say, that's not a chair, that's a chair, right? So if you don't draw distinction between chairs and non-chairs, or between computers and non-computers, you probably don't have the concept of a chair or the concept of a computer, right? Having a concept is a bit being able to draw these distinctions. And what we have there is that those people don't seem to be able to draw this. I mean, again, supposing it's not driven by the language.
So would a way to look at that be ask your other question about, would you be angered if somebody did these things or violated?
Oh, it's a good question, but I think, so what I want to resist is that the importance of a norm, whether a norm deserves a reactive attitude, an anger from a third person, or shame or guilt from a first person, is identifying moral norms, right? Now you might use the word moral this way, that's fine, it's a purely terminological question. But I think it's even in cultures that don't distinguish moral from non-moral norms, some norms are going to elicit anger when they're violated. Some norms are going to elicit shame or guilt when they're violated. There's no doubt about that. Some norms are going to be important. Other norms are going to be less important. So those distinctions are going to be found in every culture. I'm not skeptical of that. I'm just skeptical of the idea that it's the best way, when you're studying the distinction between what's moral and what's not moral, you should be driven by this distinction between norms that elicit an emotional reaction, norms that don't. Largely because that's the distinction don't map in North America. And again, the Jewish sample shows why they don't map.
Should we maybe have one more question? Eddie, did you have a question? And then we'll let Edouard relax for the rest of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Good to see you. I'll hear you, I should say.
Yeah, sorry, I'm sorry I'm not putting my camera on, but I'm sorry if you answered this already in your talk. I was sometimes distracted by the Paris beating Munich game, which I'm sure you'll appreciate. It was
Is Paris winning?
they won 3-2, so I know you'd want to hear that. But
I wanted to hear that indeed.
I wanted to know whether you think these results bear on a related question that a lot of experimental philosophers and psychologists have talked about whether most ordinary people across cultures are objectivists or relativists or subjectivists, but I don't think that one's in the mix about morality in general. So if you could just say what you think your results might tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't think they bear on it, but I think it's a really nice question for a follow-up study. So we've been looking at trust. We've mentioned trust earlier as an interesting covariate of these norms. It would be really interesting to see whether people are more likely to have an objectivist attitude towards a norm that are in the moral cluster. However, they identify the small clusters across religions versus the norms that are not into the moral clusters, and how Jews are going to be behaving with respect to the religious norms that are important for them, but they classify as being non-moral. I mean, so the prediction is that they're not going to use this norm as objective in the sense of being facts of the matter. For a very clear reason, they view these norms as being given to them by God. There's a convention, an agreement between God and themselves, right? So I'm not sure the objectivists here would be exactly the right way to be thinking about Jewish norms, but it would still be interesting to see how objectivity relates to importance, relates to trust, and using our tools to produce classifications and then look at all these measures across the types of norms we distinguish across demographic groups. I think that would be a really interesting follow-up to the type of work we've done.
Thanks. I might email you some other ideas, but
absolutely.
Well, I want to thank Edouard again so much for this presentation and for the lively and interesting question and answer. And just join me one more time in thanking him.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been really a pleasure. I wish I had met you in person.
Yeah.
Have a drink now, but maybe one day.
Yeah, I wish we were going for our dinner, right?
Right.
Yeah. But maybe well, for sure we'll have you back. So
absolutely.
in person. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye. Have a good day.